Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the origins of the Mafia. My guest for this is Louis Ferrante, author of the book Borgata, Rise of Empire, A History of the American Mafia. Louis Ferrante is a former associate of the Gambino Mafia himself. He spent 8.5 years in prison for heists and hijackings. While in prison, he turned to books and taught himself how to write. After prison, he went on to write the best-selling book, Mob Rules, and he hosted the television series called Inside the Gangster's Code. Louis Ferrante, it is my very good pleasure, sir, to welcome you to this radio program.
Thank you, Mitch, and thank you for having me.
I'm fascinated by really, as I said in the introduction, the origins of the Mafia, of the American Mafia, what actually begins in Sicily, and the importance that Sicily plays in this story. Tell me, where is, we all heard of Sicily. Where is Sicily, and what do you think is important to know about Sicily?
Sicily sits off the sort of like, if we imagine Italy as a boot, somewhere towards southern Italy. It sits off the coast in the Mediterranean, and it's somewhere sort of kind of between Italy and North Africa, which sort of places it at the crossroads of different empires throughout history. This sort of, it has been invaded so many different times. And why it's important, why I felt like it was very, very important to understand why this could have only happened in Sicily is because that's the only place the mafia could have come from. And when you begin to research it, there are so many different criminal gangs throughout the world. There have been since the beginning of time. Even in Roman times, Greco-Roman times, there were gangs that roamed the streets at different times. Through antiquity up until present day, we have gangs all over the world today that have sprung up. Usually, when countries fall, gangs appear. A lot of times, more so than when things are healthy. But I wanted to know why, of all gangs, of all these criminal gangs, of all these ethnic gangs, the mafia had become sort of like the preeminent gang. And I dug deep and very, very deep into the socioeconomic foundations of Sicily, what was happening there, the political political aspects of the whole culture. Were there political aspects? Did politics affect Sicily? Did Italy affect Sicily? How much so? And this is where I learned how the mafia began. Sicily was a unique place because of so many people had been there. Between, as I said, the Greeks, the Romans, the different gangs that invaded Rome, the Vandals, the Huns, etc. And up and through the Middle Ages, you had the Arabs there, you had the Spanish there, you had the French there after the Middle Ages, the Austrians were there. Napoleon was entrenched in Italy for a while. The British went to Sicily to stop Napoleon from taking Sicily. So this has always been this sort of like island that's been badgered by all these different powerful forces that are pulling it each way. And I wondered why the Sicilian people were such a unique people, and who are they? And what I discovered was that the Sicilian people are a mix of all these different ethnic groups and nations that have come in and out of their territory for so long, but they're a very isolated mix, and they never lost their identity. If you sort of like imagine it like diaspora Jews, wandering through the centuries, but still maintaining their identity as Jews, no matter where they went, whether it be Eastern Europe, whether it be Western Europe, whether it be the United States, whether it be South or Central America. A Jew is a Jew. When they meet each other, they still have these basic foundations that, even though their cultures are different. And it was the same thing with the Sicilians. I noticed that there's this sort of like this base that the Sicilians never wavered in, and that was importance of family, which again, the diaspora Jews also held very, very dear and sacred, was the family. So this sort of like the importance of family was extremely crucial to the development of the mafia, because what is a mafia? A mafia family. And at one point or another, I dug deep into the Middle Ages, and I was able to see that Mark Bloch, who was a brilliant writer of feudal times, said that during these times, family was everything. And at some point, power was centralized in the family. So blood families began to become extended families, where if you took an oath, you were part of this family. So I would become part of Mitch's family if I took an oath and maybe drew a drop of blood and stuff. And that's sort of what the mafia is. And it's usually there's a lot of people who are blood family in one crime family, and then there's this extended version of the family, people who come to it like myself and take an oath and become part of a family, whether through associates or sworn members who are willing to die for the family, die and kill. And I thought that was interesting. And the next thing I was able to find was during a lot of mafia historians will just like gloss over, well, the mafia sort of stemmed from feudalism, but I was never able to really find how. So once again, I dug deep into feudal times, and I was able to make for the first time ever, draw these really distinct comparisons between a feudal society and a mafia family. And for example, a feudal lord, the relationship between a feudal lord and his vassals were almost identical to the relationship between a mafia don and his soldiers. Even the oath a feudal lord required of his vassals was almost identical to the oath that a mafia soldier takes to his don and his family, his mafia family. So time and again, I found these incredible connections that, and George Friedrich Hegel, for one, said that he pointed out that don't be confused and think that feudal government was legitimate. It was never legitimate. It was privatized government. The lord could do what he wanted. He had complete say over life and death. He had complete say over the economics of his society. And this is the same with the mafia. The mafia don has complete control over life and death, and the mafia don could say who dies and when and who's allowed to make money in what particular area of crime. So this is sort of like the connections were endless, and I was able to really then bring it up in the womb of the Sicily, how the mobsters, the original mafiosos grew in the womb of feudal Sicily. And when feudalism was abolished in the early 1800s in Sicily, a lot of people, I think the mob, for example, said, well, we were comfortable with this form of government. We were comfortable with this sort of privatized local government. We don't want overlords, and we're happy with it. We're going to continue. And then the next step was during the unification of Italy. Sicily had been tossed around between
let me just underscore what you just said there. So is that the link? Is that sort of where you find the beginning of the mafia when feudalism comes to an end? And you're right, this happens. The British ends feudalism. I guess this is related to them going after Napoleon in 1812. When that happens, is that the link that then starts this tradition of a mafia?
Yes, it's the first time where I believe the mafia emerged from sort of like, they were people who were comfortable with a landowner, with dealing with their own justice. An old man in the piazza would be the rule of law. He was the final arbiter of all legal cases in that particular village. And that was really important. Then there's a few other aspects that I was able to tie in. Another one was the formation of secret societies in the 17 and 1800s. For example, we're all familiar with the Jacobins in France, but there were other secret societies throughout Europe that wanted to overthrow the ancient regimes. And one of those secret societies was in Italy called Young Italy, which Mazzini, the founder of Italy, was part of. And he joined Young Italy. And at some point or another, when the unification of Italy occurs, the secret societies were disbanded because they were no longer needed. Okay, now we have a liberal democracy. We're going to fall in step with Western Europe, the rest of Western Europe. There's no need for secret societies. But there were a lot of aspects of these secret societies that the mafia, who had already adopted certain things from feudalism, had taken from these secret societies. Once again, the secret societies were notorious for blood oaths. You live and die for the cause. They were extremely interested in pedigree, which the mafia is. This guy's a good guy. He came from, I know his uncle, I know his father. He's good blood. He's a good kid. The secret societies of Italy was extremely concerned with that. They had monikers, like the mafia has nicknames, in part to avoid police detection. They had capos and capo regimes. They had sort of like Young Italy would appoint one man over 10 or 100, and he would be sort of like the captain who would then answer to the capo di tutto capi, who was the head of it all. And that's exactly how the mafia formed its ranks. It wasn't necessarily from Roman times, which a lot of people confused and said, well, the mafia pulled it from Roman times. Maybe they did, but unwittingly. The secret societies of Italy that did this same thing were available to them, and they had disbanded just as the unification of Italy occurs. Now, when that unification occurs, what happened in Sicily is the Sicilian people did not want to become part of Italy. They were promised
Again, there are people that are subject to empires for, it sounds like a couple thousand years up to this point.
Exactly. And this is the first time they felt like when they fought for Garibaldi, they would be given their independence, and they were told they would. And they told there would be land distribution. A lot of people wanted land, and they fought for Garibaldi for that reason as well. And at some point or another, they're told, hey, you know what? You're part of Italy now, and we'll take a vote just to verify it. And many believe that the vote was fixed. And they despised Italy and considered Italy now as their latest overlord. And they said, now it's just, and a lot of people in Sicily didn't even know what Italy was or where it was. You went into these villages where travelers, for example, there was the age of travel when people, journalistic traveling, when people went through Russia and they went through different places in Europe and they wrote about them, which was an interesting age. I have a lot of the books here on my shelves and I love reading about it. Well, this guy, Sannino, Franchetti and Sannino went to Sicily, and they realized there were people there who didn't even know where Italy was or what Italy was. And then you had to try to explain to them that you're part of Italy. And how are we part of Italy? They understood they were once part of Austria, once part of France, once part of Spain, but now we're part of Italy. So then Italy started to swagger around and tell Sicily how to behave. Now, Italy was trying to fall in line, as I said, with the sort of the democracies of Western Europe at that time. And Italy was thought of as sort of backwoods, these backwoods people. And, now Italy was saying, well, no, it's not us. Northern Italy especially, we're fine, but it's Southern Italy and Sicily that really have fallen behind throughout the ages. And it's them. Those are the people who we need to bring them up to date with what's going on here. And the Sicilians were incensed. And, Sicilian people only fought for their families throughout the ages, and now they're told they're going to be conscripted into a military. A lot of times the parents would tell their sons, take to the mountains, go become a bandit and send us food home. Just rob foreigners. Don't rob us, but any foreigners you see, send the food and money home, but don't join the army. We don't want to go fight for geopolitics or, politics gone awry throughout Europe and throughout the world. We're only interested in the survival of our own family. So a lot of times the Sicilians banded together. Now, there was another aspect that was really, really interesting is the Arabs. During the Arab control of Sicily, the Arabs were very influential, and you could still see it throughout the landscape of Sicily. There are churches that look like mosques to this day in Western Sicily. And when the Arabs from North Africa were pushed into the western regions of Sicily, a lot of those Arabs, I contend, to be the founding fathers of the original mafia. And I was able to trace a lot of that back to them. They were very, very... there are books about tribal Arab life in North Africa that are almost also identical to mafia families, where the patriarch was everything. The patriarch was the guiding law, the guiding rule. And just so your listeners make sure.
But is that different than? I mean, most older societies are quite patriarchal, right?
Yes, but a lot of the older patriarchal societies. Let's say, for example, there's a 5 or 6 out of 10 comparisons you could make. There was almost like 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 at times with the Arabs, which was really interesting. And again, just not to confuse you or your listeners, I was able to blend in the book how feudal societies, secret societies of Italy, and Arab culture and the Arab Berbers of Western Sicily all contributed to this founding of the mafia. So just in case someone's listening and said, well, gee, you mentioned feudal society, now you mentioned secret societies, now you mentioned the Arab Berbers of Sicily, I'm confused. They all play a part.
These are the different strands of influence.
Exactly, exactly. Just as I come from Queens and there are different influences that made me a criminal. When I first, was it my home life? Was it my friends outside? Was it the neighborhood I came from? Yeah, they all played a part. And I was able to really, really trace the different parts and how they contributed to this formation of the mafia.
You make an argument in your book that the word mafia itself can be linked to Arabic?
Yes. I was able to find, for the first time ever, and I leave this to future historians for debate, but what I was able to find in my research was I wanted to know where different words came from. And mafia slash mafioso, kind of easy to trace. It appears in the lexicon for the first time, sort of 1860s or 1870s Sicily. But the word mafia itself, I saw that a lot of people attributed it to the 12 or 1300s when the Sicilians ejected this conqueror or that conqueror. And nobody really had any basis, no evidence to provide for these guesses that they were making. And then there were a lot of people who attributed to Arab words. For example, one person said, well, it's the Arab word for a proud horse, which is like a proud individual, and a mafioso is proud, so there's pride involved, and therefore it's this word. Or this is a cave dweller, and this is the Arab word for a cave dweller, and a lot of times the bandits slash early mafiosos used to take to the mountains and hide in the caves, so that's the word. I was able to find a really interesting word, and for those of us familiar with the Victorian General Gordon Pasha, who was instrumental in trying to prevent the siege of Khartoum. Gordon Pasha was killed at that siege, and he was overthrown / killed by the Mahdi. And who was the Mahdi? The Mahdi, throughout the ages in Islamic culture, has been the person who sort of anointed himself the savior of the people. And this was an interesting person, this Mahdi. And if you take the word Mahdi and you have these Arab Berbers who were pushed into the western regions of Sicily, where the mafia begins, Palermo and Agrigento, these are the places where the Arabs were heavily populated these areas, and their influence is still visible. They were there, and if you take the word Mahdi and you say that the Mahdist regime was considered the Mahdiya, and these people were responsible for pushing back against the Italian government, originally based in Turin and eventually based in Rome. And when the Italian government was trying to push around Sicily, these people in Western Sicily were saying, no, we're not going to have it, and we'll defend the people here. And this is how we do things. We're not going to go fall in line with you. These were the first real rebels in Sicily, and still are to this day. Palermo is still the chief capital of the mafia in the world, other than New York. But the Mahdi, that word I found very interesting. The Mahdi, the people of the Mahdi's sort of army was considered the Mahdist regime, also known as the Mahdiya, which was one letter away from mafia. And I was blown away when I found this. And then if you go and you trace how people identify the Mahdist regime and the Mahdi, and how the early people in Sicily tried to identify the mafia, for example, Cesare Mori, who was Benito Mussolini's prefect, who went to Sicily to try to eradicate the mafia. He describes what he found to be the mafia and their characteristics, etc. And it's almost, you could take them and overlap them with what people say the Mahdist regime, the Mahdiya, was about. And this was incredible to me. And I pulled quotes from different sources to make these juxtapose these comparisons. And I feel strongly that Mahdiya, which was one letter away from mafia, was where the mafia came from.
Luis Ferrante is our guest. He joins us for a conversation about his book called Borgata, Rise of Empire, a history of the American Mafia. So we've gotten up to Italian independence. Sicily has denied its own independence. Do you think this, because when we think of the mafia today, we think of a criminal institution, for lack of a better term, at least that for me, a criminal enterprise. Do you think this is the beginning of that notion of what a mafia is?
Yes. And the reason being is that a lot of it goes to labeling theory, which was this theory in psychology where a crime isn't necessarily a crime until we label it as a society as such. And a lot of people in Sicily who did things their own way, if I had a problem, I didn't go to the police. I went to, as I said, the old man in the piazza. And I said to him, whether it was my grandfather, my uncle, or someone I knew, hey, can you do me a favor and help me out? This is the problem I have. Or all of everything was pretty much land rights, water rights. Everything was sort of controlled by one person, usually in a village, and he was usually the patriarch of an extended family. He had power, and at some point or another, when the new Italian government takes a look at this and they say, well, that's criminal, and the Sicilians are like, well, what do you mean it's criminal? We've always done it this way. No, it's criminal. You should see our law books here in Rome. It's criminal. Well, this is how we've always done it, and this is how we'll continue to do it. And at that point, it's labeled criminal. It's labeled a crime. So the local don in the piazza, who was always just this sort of like, huggy, grandfatherly type who may kill somebody if he has to, if you get out of line, if you rape a girl in the village, if you steal something you shouldn't have stole, he was justice. He called for your death. All of a sudden, he's a criminal. And so, but he wasn't a criminal until he was labeled a criminal. So obviously, I consider myself sort of like schooled in law. I reversed one of my federal cases from prison. I studied law while I was in prison. I helped a lot of other people get out of jail through filing briefs for them.
Were you a jailhouse lawyer?
I was at one time. Oh. That's correct. Mm-hmm. And I helped a lot of people who, look, I'm an advocate of harsh justice for people who deserve it, but mercy for people who deserve mercy as well. And if I was in prison and I found somebody who deserved mercy or was railroaded or was given a lot more time than they deserved, I was really, really quick to try to help all the time. And I was able to reverse one of my own cases, and I did get a lot of other people out. So with that basic understanding of the law that I gave myself while I was in prison, I was able to understand sort of like a crime is a crime when we call it a crime. So I have friends that did 20 and 30 years for marijuana distribution, and in those same states that severely punished them, it's legal now. And why is it legal? Because at some point when society realizes, well, it's everywhere, what are we going to do? And they de-illegalize it. So that's sort of like, it's society who creates what's a crime and what's not. Oscar Wilde was imprisoned for, his sexual preferences that are considered not a big deal today. If you're homosexual, so what? We all have, I don't know if that's the right term. Things change so fast. But if you're gay, I have friends who are gay. I have people in my family who are gay. Who cares? But Oscar Wilde went to jail for that. So society basically makes, the laws according to their culture and their beliefs. And it was the same thing with the Sicilian Mafia. Sicilian mafiosos weren't considered criminal until Italy proper said, what you're doing is criminal, and we have to stamp it out. And the rest of Sicily, because the mafiosos were sort of at the head, these Madias or mafias were sort of at the head of this rebellion movement against Italy proper. It only pushed the people even closer to the mafia at that point. So why did people for decades, if not, the better part of 100 years, protect the mafia when people came to their neighborhoods? It wasn't always that they were terrified and scared of them. A lot of times they felt like, why should I give up the local mafia don? He's the guy who helps me get a job when I'm broke and I can't feed my family. He's the guy who helps me defend myself if somebody else who tries to bully me. I go to him and I tell him, and he says, no, you can't beat this guy up. You can't do that to this man. Go rob from somebody else who has a lot of money. Don't steal from the poor. These mafiosos, they weren't. I'm not, let nobody mistake that I'm trying to make them out as sort of these Mr. Nice guys. They were obviously capable of murdering people if they had to, but the people in these villages did see them as something more than what we see them as today. They saw them as sort of like, the hand of justice that was fair, that was temperate, that was merciful. So, I was able once again to I think reveal certain things that we may have never known before in this first volume of Borgata.
So again, Borgata, and this is a history of the American Mafia, and I've really focused, and I appreciate you going there on Sicily. Does the Mafia and immigration to the United States, to America, is very important in this story. Does the Mafia already, is there already a Mafia in Sicily, or is this a Mafia that actually forms in the United States by Sicilians who come from Italy, or from Sicily, excuse me?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Both, though slightly more so the second, the latter part of your what you said. Basically, the Mafia now is formed in Sicily as this sort of resistance movement to the new Italian government. And mafiosos now, I think at one point or another, they just threw up their arms and said, if everything we do is criminal, what's stopping us just from becoming criminals? We still want to control the land and the construction projects, etc. So we're going to. And they become now outright criminals at some point. So now you have all these criminals running around Sicily. And the better part of the Sicilian people, obviously, were just hardworking people. Had nothing to do with this mafia. They were happy they were there. Some of them weren't happy with them. Whatever the case was, at some point or another, the United States, the institution of slavery is abolished in the United States, the 1860s, which is around the same time the unification of Italy occurs. So the abolition of slavery coinciding with the unification of Italy creates this sort of mass exodus from different regions of southern Italy, specifically Sicily, who say, we're poor and we're looking for a better life. They need labor in the United States. Once they abolished slavery, a lot of people were looking for dirt cheap labor, especially in the South. But across the United States, a lot of people always needed cheap labor, but in the South, especially after the abolition of slavery. So this huge Italian immigrant wave starts to come to the United States, and it grows. And at some point toward the late 1800s, you're getting millions of people leaving southern Italy, specifically Sicily, but also the lower regions of the peninsula in Italy proper. And they're coming to the United States and they're looking for work. And with these migrant waves that flood into the United States, 99.9% of which are just people looking for a better life, wanting to work hard, wanting to pour their blood and sweat out for a better life for themselves and their children. With them comes the mafia. And the mafia sort of rides in with the wave. And a lot of them are fugitives from Sicily who are sort of wanted for whatever crimes they may have committed in Sicily, and then they either leave. Some of them escape prison. Some of them leave prison. Some of them are let out of prison. Some of them are categorized as rehabilitated and then sent to the United States, knowing they were not rehabilitated. But a lot of these Sicilian mafiosos start to flood into the United States. And because the Italian labor force was so instrumental at that time in growing the United States, the Italians, I found numerous comments where people said, we can't get along without the Italians. They're the hardest workers we've ever seen. They're like horses, these people. They're like work animals, farm animals. They just work and work and work. And the Italians, these hardworking Italians, only wanted to save their money and work. And these mafiosos sort of benefited from that in the sense that if all the Italian workers, laborers, controlled, for example, were the dominant force on, let's say, a particular waterfront, then the mobster needed only come in and organize them into a union or into a voting block. And he had some type of now bigger control over what products come in, over stopping ships, over stopping trucking that are picking up the shipments that are coming in on the ships. So they had huge control. For example, the South Street Seaport was controlled by the mafia. How was it controlled by the mafia? Well, all these Italians are working down there on the waterfront, and they're unloading all the fish coming in. And the fish, fish being perishable, you only got a few hours to get this fish off the dock and into a freezer somewhere before it rots. So there's huge opportunity for the Italian mafiosos to say, well, you know what? We'll stop the trucking going in and out of here. We'll mobilize the Italians, and they'll do a sit down if we don't get what we want. And, this fish, you want it to your retail and wholesale stores quick, you better do what we say. And next thing you know, they're in control of the entire waterfront, which morphed into much later on in the book. I get to it at some point where the United States Navy, naval intelligence, approaches the mobsters who control the waterfront and said, we're fearful of Nazi sabotage during World War II. You got German U-boats out there. They're coming near our coastline. We've picked up a couple. And there was a ship that burnt in New York. We want to make sure that this doesn't happen. If it was sabotage, we don't believe it was, but it could have just as easily been sabotage. And they make a deal with the mafia to be our roving lighthouse on the eastern seaboard. Tell us when you spot anything that's doesn't belong. And the mafia put out word to all the sea captains, you let us know when you dock, if you've seen anything out there at sea, and all the sea people, all the people working the docks, the longshoremen, tell us what you see and what you can do, and get these ships loaded as quickly as possible, the Italian mafia tells them, and get the men and the goods and the ammunition. We were the arsenal of democracy. The arsenal of the democracies during World War II, the United States was. So the mafia tells them, get these ships loaded as quickly as possible so we could then supply the Allies in Europe, mainly originally Britain, after Winston Churchill, as he famously said, stood alone. The Brits basically did stand alone for quite some time until Pearl Harbor. But at that point, we had to start supplying Europe. We were supplying them to a certain degree before that, the Brits. We had the Lend-Lease, et cetera, that FDR was able to arrange. But for the most part, though, when it got big, we needed the mafia to make sure that the waterfront ran right.
It is interesting to think about the relationship of the mafia to early unions.
Mm-hmm. To early what? I'm sorry,
Unions.
Mitch?
Unions.
Oh, unions. That's correct. Yeah. And I go through that as well. The union infiltration was sort of a combination between Italians and Jews. And that, again, goes to the workforce. A lot of the Jewish immigrants, there was also a migration. There were also a lot of Jews who fled Eastern Europe. There were a lot of pogroms in Eastern Europe at the time when the Sicilians and Southern Italians were coming in. When I say other Southern Italians, I mean from Naples, Calabria, etc., Bari. And my family was from Naples, Sicily, and Bari. I have a grandparent from each, 2 from Bari and 1 from Naples, 1 from Sicily. And they all came here around the same time. Later, they came for the same reasons too, to make better lives for themselves. But basically, I'm sorry, Mitch. Rewind one more time.
Well, it's
the unions.
It's interesting to think about the connection of labor unions and the mafia.
Yeah, correct. So the unions basically, a lot of Jews were fleeing Eastern Europe, pogroms in Eastern Europe around the same time the Southern Italians got here. So the Jews were working in the garment industry, a lot of them, as were the Italians. My grandmother used to work in a sweatshop. I could remember when I was a little kid picking her up, and there were hundreds of ladies, older ladies, a lot of them, working at sewing machines. And we'd have to find my grandmother in this sea of sewing machines and tell her, we're here to pick you up. And she'd leave. She'd literally work to the last minute till we came together. I could remember that. So it's not that far away, not that long ago. So anyway, the Jews had a lot of people working in the garment industry, as did the Italians, which created this partnership between the Jewish and Italian gangsters to sort of mobilize these people into a workforce. And the first one who championed most of this infiltration was Lepke Borgata, who was a Jewish gangster who was partners directly with Albert Anastasia, who was an Italian gangster, and Lucky Luciano, who was an Italian gangster. Borgata was very close with both of them. And through this partnership that Borgata had with Anastasia and Luciano, he was able to dominate a lot of these unions, and many of which the laborers were Jewish women, Jewish men, and a lot of Italians. So there was sort of like, once again, as I had explained, just how the Italians sort of monopolized the waterfront through Italian labor. They were able to do the same with the garment industry through Italian and Jewish labor, and they partnered with Jewish gangsters in doing so. And once they controlled all of those unions and infiltrated them, they had tremendous power in politics. You could tell your union to vote a certain way. That still occurs in American politics today, where you'll hear the such and such union is voting for this president, or the such and such union has endorsed that president. So if we can imagine that still happening today, we could easily imagine it happening back then in the 1930s, where it was even more important. And one particular guy, Sidney Hillman, who Lepke Borgata eventually pushed around, found it difficult to push around in the beginning because he was so powerful, but eventually Borgata had mafia help and was able to sort of have Sidney Hillman deal with Lepke Borgata because of the mafia's help, and sort of accepted him in his sort of garment fiefdom. But Sidney Hillman is a perfect example of this. Sidney Hillman was direct in President Roosevelt's war cabinet, his liaison with American labor. Hillman was. And Hillman was also a direct associate of Lepke Borgata, who was in direct partnership with Albert Anastasia and Lucky Luciano. So here you have, the biggest mobsters of the time, sort of 1 or 2 removed from the president of the United States. And at one time, they went to the 1932 Democratic National Convention, and the mafia did try to sort of sway who would become president, because Roosevelt was from New York, as was Al Smith at the time. And they wanted to sort of choose who was going to be the Democratic candidate. And as I understand it, FDR, who I'm a big fan of, by the way, was a tremendous, to me, I don't think anybody could have fought World War II as brilliantly as FDR did, just by the people he put in place. But FDR pretty much duped the mob at the convention. He made them promises. He said, if you guys back me, I'll do this, that, and the other thing. He wanted to kill a few rackets committees that were going after mobsters and stuff, and he promised to do that. And then he duped them at the end. He got his nomination, and he said, you guys ain't getting nothing from me. And Lucky Luciano made a really, really interesting comment. He said, I don't blame him for what he did. I was a shit-ass double-crosser just like him, and I would have double-crossed him if I had a chance. So he double-crossed me. It's the way it goes. So, and FDR wasn't one to be beholden to anybody. Anybody who's studied enough about FDR, really, really brilliant guy. I mean,
that's
incredible.
Interesting. The infiltration of politics by the mafia is important. And I got the sense in preparing for our conversation, it's important then to understand prohibition and how the mafia approached prohibition. It was an opportunity for them.
It was. And it was the first time that the mafia was able to be seen as the sort of like sexy gangsters that they're sometimes seen as today. How movies may portray them as today, to this day. And it started at Prohibition. So before Prohibition, the mob is, coming against the press now and then, coming into the press now and then as people who murdered this one, shoved this guy in a barrel, killed that one, threw him off a bridge, a body floated up here. This body was found decomposed. So they're really not like this sexy element of American society. They're bloodthirsty gangsters. We don't really need these people. And then Prohibition comes along, which was the greatest error in government, as Elihu Root said, the greatest error in government when they vote and pass through Congress and the Senate that we're going to go dry. The United States is no longer going to provide alcohol for its own people. We're not going to do this unless it's medicinal purposes, etc. In small areas, we continued it now and then in little small areas, but for the most part, you can't drink anymore. You can't get drunk. You can't have social drinks. No more. The American people were incensed because it was a small lobby that pushed this through, that grew bigger and bigger and caught everyone off guard who thought it could never happen. Companies like Anheuser-Busch were like dumbfounded, like this happened? How did that happen? They never thought it could happen. A lot of the German beer companies early on, a lot of wine companies, liquor companies never thought this could happen. And the people never thought no one could take away our liquor. But it shows what a small lobby could do if they push hard enough and they get their way, and they did. And they convinced enough people in Congress and the Senate to pass it. And Prohibition goes through. And next thing you know, the people are desperate for alcohol. And the mob says, what an opportunity. Here we are, where the underground, we control the underworld. If we provide booze, which everyone wants, we won't be seen as these bad guys. I mean, we're basically just supplying a demand for the American people that the government is too stupid to give them. And next thing you know, they partner with the Jews who had connections in different distilleries overseas. And the mafia then had the distribution network set up in the States for the most part. And Arnold Rothstein was a big player in the beginning. Brilliant guy. He was sort of like the funder of larcenous schemes, they called him. But he saw an opportunity here. He dumped a couple of $100,000 into getting the Great Lakes up in the higher region of the Northeast. We were able to bring in a lot of alcohol from Canada. Canadians were producing alcohol and sending it to the United States. So we had these rum runners running across the Great Lakes. Rothstein was one of the big original funders of that, as were the Italian gangsters who could control the area. And then Rothstein opened up a distillery for us across the pond up in Scotland and was able to get top-notch liquor. And by the Italians, for example, Lucky Luciano, having access to the best, you got liquor that was fermented in the Scottish Highlands as opposed to people who were making bathtub gin, really gave the mafia, a leg up on this industry. You guys are the premier.
They were providing the best liquor.
The best. Yeah, the best. And, you got 12-year-old scotch that people could get their hands on from the Italian mafia through the Jewish connections. And it made them, sort of like the premier distributors of alcohol throughout the country. And that's that was when they established themselves as sort of like these sexy individuals who were able to provide alcohol. And then what happened was when eventually when Prohibition was repealed, all of these corrupt connections that the mafia made through Prohibition, where either Prohibition agents or local ward leaders or mayors or governors or congressmen who were sort of in bed with the mob, who the mob paid off, a lot of those illicit relationships continued on. If you've been paying a guy for a few years now for something that this particular individual in politics did not feel was such a bad thing, now you say to him, like, hey, listen, we just want to gamble now. Gambling isn't so bad, is it? We want to open up a casino over here or there. And you had these already corrupt relationships that continued on after Prohibition and continued on up and through my own time. A lot of these relationships.
Not easy to leave the mob. And I don't mean just for a member, but if you have a connection to them as a politician, not so easy just to cut off ties, I suspect.
Exactly. I mean, they got you, first of all. I mean, you've done business with them for so long. So there's sort of like this mutual destruction. It'd be hard for you to start going after them for something new that they're doing, knowing that just a few days ago, they were doing something with you. So there's sort of like every incentive for them to continue the relationship. And then at the same time, there's an interesting perfect storm that occurs. At the same time, you have repeal. And the mafia is walking away from Prohibition with all these deep pockets. They have cash up the gazoo that they don't know what to do with. So the mafia sort of has all this extra cash laying around from Prohibition. And the market crashes, the stock market, the major stock market crashes. And people are throwing themselves out of windows. And the banks are all going belly up. And the few banks that are left are saying, we just can't give everybody a loan. We understand you need money for your business to keep it going, but sorry, the doors are closed at the moment, and it's really hard to get cash loans. Well, the mafia steps in and says, well, we got plenty of cash, and we're happy to provide you with the loans you need, but we want a little bit of a piece of the business that you're in. And that's how the mafia then reached out and embedded themselves in a lot of industries that they still remain in today. Whether it be the restaurant industry, the construction industry, the development of different real estate across the country. Whatever industries the mafia sort of began to infiltrate was very, very dependent on the cash they were able to provide when the banks weren't giving it after the stock market crash. Nobody had cash but the gangsters. And the gangsters said, okay, but once we give you this money, we're going to dig our claws into you. And we're not letting go, just so you know. And people were desperate for cash. So they said, that's fine. I need to feed my family. And I will make a deal with the devil if that's what it has to be. I need to feed my family. And if the devil's willing to feed my family, then that's fine.
I mean, you say the devil, but what I'm thinking in my mind is a feudal lord.
Yeah, that's
sort
right.
Like it's sort of a new era of feudalism, not necessarily, not connected to land anymore, to property, right, but still that relationship.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. It's exactly right. And time and again, they reveal themselves to be that feudal society that is existing in contemporary times, that isn't aware of its extinction, that's almost sort of existing in this perforated bubble, perforated time capsule. So yeah, exactly. Incredible.
When do we get the rise of the first powerful mafia, and who is it?
So the rise of the first, interesting to me, was as a New York gangster in the 80s and 90s coming up. I went away when I was 25, but from the time I was 13 till I was 25, my entire life was a crime in progress. All I did was whether stealing cars, a chop shop, hijacking trucks, and then bigger and bigger crimes and heists. That's all I ever did until the federal government put me away for a long time. So I was interested to learn that it wasn't New York, because New York is the dominant place. It's sort of like the Rome of the Roman Empire. There's Alexandria, there's different places throughout the Roman Empire where you could point to and say, well, the Romans were there too. Eventually they went to Constantinople, etc. But no, there's only one Rome, and that Rome was New York. So no matter how far flung the empire was, the mafia empire, its headquarters was always New York. But I found that the original mafia families did not come from New York. They came from Louisiana, specifically New Orleans. And that was interesting for me to learn, because the New Orleans mafia still exists today to some degree, still existed when I was on the street, but it's small, it's watered down, they're not that powerful in contrast to New York. So I was stunned to learn that it was New Orleans. But when you start to get into why it was New Orleans, it becomes apparent why it was New Orleans. When the Italian wave of immigrants first came here, the Italian immigrant wave from southern Italy wanting to work, first of all, the Italians were used to the Mediterranean climate. So they wanted to go to a climate like their own. They weren't used to 10 feet of snow in New York, where a lot of the gangsters are today. They weren't used to sort of digging out the, digging out the car, but digging out the wagon back then, from a snowstorm. They weren't used to like getting logs and heating your house and stuff, providing wood, getting the wood ready for the winter. The mafiosos who first came here wanted a Mediterranean climate like their own, and they found that in Louisiana. And then it also goes back to the desperate need for cheap labor when slavery was abolished. When a lot of these sugar and tobacco and cotton plantations didn't have workers, they said, well, what are we going to do? Well, these Southern Italian immigrants were happy to work for almost slave labor.
And I imagine the plantation owners would rather hire for these very low wages Italian immigrants rather than recently freed.
That's right.
Black people.
The recently freed slaves. I mean, that's a whole different subject I'd love to tackle one day. A lot of the recently freed slaves had it harder when they were freed.
Oh, yeah.
Because it was, the oppression and the discrimination never stopped. I don't want to say
they weren't going to hire them. They weren't going to hire them. They'd rather hire Italian immigrants who, weren't, were they white at this point? Who knows? I mean, they eventually become white, but this is still a different time.
Yeah. And what's interesting is they weren't considered white. Italians were not considered white. They were called N's, the word, the N word, inside out. They were considered pizza N's. So there were a lot of slang, discriminatory labels attached to Italians that compared them to African Americans. And the Italians were happy to live and work amongst the African Americans in the poor neighborhoods. They voted for anything that helped the African Americans. And I found New York Times articles that basically that said that explicitly, that the Italians voted along with the blacks. Anything that they could do to help the blacks, they were happy to help them. So the Italians were considered sort of like these blacks, quote, blacks turned inside out, which was also a further discrimination toward blacks, because once again, as if the direct discrimination against blacks wasn't enough, now they're being, used as sort of like this comparison with another group of undesirables. But the Italians were considered less than white. And because of that, they were sort of like, okay, we can't have slave labor anymore, and we don't want to hire the African Americans, so we'll just hire these Italians who were pretty close to African Americans, but they work hard and they just got here, so throw them on the plantation. And they were the second biggest group that was lynched in the South. Italian Americans were. And I found pictures of them hanging from trees, which was new to me. I knew we were called wops, guineas, greaseballs. I knew all of the derogatory names when I was growing up, but I didn't know we were hung from trees too. And not to take away from the African American experience, everybody knows it's common knowledge now that they absolutely suffered the most in this country. We all know that. But the Italians probably were a close second. If you had to put somebody behind them, it would have been the Italian Americans, who were lynched the most in the South next to the African Americans. And I did not know that. They're actually the biggest mass lynching in American history was a mass lynching that happened in New Orleans.
Do you think we're almost out of time here. So much we can't get to because of the tyranny of the clock, I like to call it. But just quickly, do you think this also explains why then you would get the rise of this first mafia in New Orleans?
Yes, it definitely contributed to it. A lot of mobsters, even if it was just through justification, hardworking Italian Americans did not want anything to do with the mafia. But the mafia was able to say to each other, to themselves, as a justification, look how discriminated against we are. We need to band together. We need to stay together. If we're going to survive this experience, we're going to have to be just as tough and strong as the people around us. And if they think they're going to push us around, we got something for them. And a lot of it, yes, even in my time, a lot of it we were told when I was a kid. I was told that we were still being discriminated against, and this was how we defended ourselves from it. And by time I was growing up, it was a myth. I mean, I had every opportunity. I just wasn't aware of it. I needed somebody to lead me by the hand and tell me I could become this, I could become that. Unfortunately, I didn't have that. But that that sort of Italian, I guess, attitude was prevalent in the mafia early on, and it was justified. If everywhere you look, people are being lynched and people are being called all these horrible discriminatory names, it's easy to say, hey, we got each other. And we have every right to carry guns and shoot people if we want, because look what we're up against. And we don't want to end up hanging from a tree too. So yeah, it was a justification in some ways.
Louis Ferrante has been our guest. He has joined us for a conversation about his book called Borgata, Rise of Empire, A History of the American Mafia. We just scratched the surface. This is all you could really do in 50 minutes. And this is also volume 1 of a 3-volume series that is coming. So, Louis Ferrante, thank you for doing this, and I hope you'll come back so we could talk about future volumes and even get more into this history. But I thank you very much for taking this time today.
Thank you so much, Mitch. I appreciate it.